Welcome everyone. Welcome to Ben Anderson, who's giving us our first talk for the Critical Heritage Seminar sessions. Ben's a lecturer in 20th century European history at Keele. He's interested in, quote, the interaction between people and their environment in the modern era, and also how it intersects with bottom-up heritage and community projects, as we'll see, which brings us to his talk today, which is about his work as PI, long-suffering PI, perhaps. I don't know, we'll see, on a couple of AHRC projects called Decommissioning the 20th Century and Planning Creativity. And he's going to talk to us about, shall we say, the trials and tribulations of trying to make public-facing projects happen in this plague year of our Lord 2020. So, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'll just see if I can't get my presentation working. Yeah, should be good at this already, but well, as I'm sure you all know. So if I do that, can you all see that? It's obviously not on the right page. Anyway.
Yeah.
So all good?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Well, yes, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for welcoming me to the seminar. It's really given me a chance to step back a little bit from what has been a quite, as Ian kind of alluded to, quite a trying period in my life. I mean, I try and retain a little bit of perspective over this. I mean, I have some research projects and so on that are in a bit of a state, as you'll probably work out, but on the other hand, I've still got my job, and on the whole, I'm quite healthy. So I think I can complain a lot and whinge, but basically, there are other people in much worse situations as a result of this pandemic than I am. So anyway, I'm going to be presenting on. I've called this Decommissioning the 20th Century, but actually, I'm going to be talking about two interlinked projects in this presentation, one of which is called Decommissioning the 20th Century, and that was a networking AHRC, well, formerly at least an AHRC networking grant, which began at the beginning of this year. But also I'm going to be talking about another project called Planning Creativity, which was formerly a follow-on funding grant for Decommissioning the 20th Century. Now, this is a bit confusing because the two projects actually run completely concurrent to one another, and they rely on one another for their research outputs. So in many ways, this was the AHRC, trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, I think. They effectively got some funding from the NERC to participate in a broader funding network called the Landscape Decisions Research Framework. I think it's the full title. And this is a broader effort across disciplines, not just the arts and humanities, although it has attracted a lot of research in the arts and humanities, but not just in the arts and humanities, about how we can better make decisions about the future of landscape. So while I'm going to be talking quite a lot about heritage and the history of heritage on a few of these sites and how heritage links in with some of these aspects, in many ways, these two projects are also in important ways effectively kind of planning projects about heritage sites. And so the aspect, the role of planning looms large in quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about. And as you can see, there were quite a few organisations involved. I'm only going to put up the logos on this page because otherwise they take up far too much space. But there are a number of universities involved, as you can see in the University of Lincoln, represented by Ian Waits. So thanks very much for the introduction, Ian. And our kind of formal partner is the Chatterley Whitfield Friends organisation. But we are also working with an organisation in Gainsborough, the Gainsborough Heritage Association, and the Friends of the New Forest, who are operating on the south coast, as you might expect. So this is quite a broad project. It involves quite a number of partners across the UK, all having their own role to play. So what am I going to do today? Well, on the first place, in a sense, I kind of want to, move a little bit beyond just providing a really sort of a basic kind of rundown of the projects, how COVID-19 has provided an absolute nightmare for these projects, and kind of where we're at. So I'm going to start by doing something I haven't really done before, and that's to provide, seek to provide at least a narrative of decommissioning for the two sites, which we kind of on this project regard as the past and the present of decommissioning. So I'll talk a little about all three sites, but I'm going to focus on those two, because I think they bring out some of the ways in which decommissioning poses challenges for the heritage of industrial sites, but they do so in some ways quite contradictory ways, even though in fact they're operating and influenced by many of the same institutions and statutory instruments. So some of it might be proved to be a little bit dull. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But fundamentally, we've got two quite important case studies there that reveal some of the different challenges that the different large industrial sites can pose to the maintenance of industrial heritage in particular. I'm then going to just spend a little bit of time talking about the original projects, before their ethos, what we were planning on doing, what our objectives were, before explaining why they're in many ways defunct as a result of COVID-19. When I talk about COVID-19, I'm going to effectively do so in a way in which I think it's worthwhile, just for the purpose of sharing, I think, in many ways, the impact that it's had on the sort of direct impact that it's had on this particular project. But as I outlined in the abstract, I also want to raise, and all I'm going to do is raise these questions, basically. I want to raise some questions that we perhaps might discuss about what COVID-19 might mean for the planning of heritage in the future, and how we should think about planning things like public engagement, and how far COVID-19 we should perhaps think about as a normal exception, something that actually, perhaps we should have expected it to happen. We should expect it to happen once every 100 years, and something that happens once every 100 years is something which should be built into plans. And finally, I'm just going to basically outline where I think we're at, and this is largely in the hope of gaining some suggestions of what else we might do yet, because as you'll see, there's a positive side to COVID-19 in that I'm in some ways now trying to find a way of justifying the expenditure of some money that I have effectively been awarded, but which I now can't actually spend on exactly the thing that we said we were going to spend it on. So we're thinking about, okay, well, what else can we do here to meet the objectives of the original two projects? So, but I want to start off by talking about some of these narratives, and I'm going to be concentrating on two of the three sites at the centre of our projects. The three sites that we're looking at, as I said, represent the past, the present, and the future of decommissioning. And I'm going to be focusing on the two that represent the past and the present. So you'll see at the bottom right here, this is Chatterley Whitfield Colliery. It's quite a new shot despite being in black and white. And this represents in many ways the past of decommissioning. It represents the decommissioning of coal mining in the 1970s and 1980s, and it's the last significant site of coal mining heritage remaining in North Staffordshire, and in fact is supposed to be, according to English Heritage at least, the most complete set of deep mine workings in the UK. So it's an important heritage site. It's also a heritage site which repeatedly comes in Historic England's top 10 list of sites at risk, and I think probably at risk is something of an understatement when it comes to Chatterley Whitfield. But part of the reason for that has to do with the history of decommissioning of the site itself. I'm also going to spend a lot less time, but still a little bit of time, talking about Fawley Power Station, which is this oil-fired power station, which used to stand on the banks of Southampton Water and the Solent, just opposite Southampton. It's in the process of being demolished. We're reliably informed that at present the only thing remaining is the chimney. So we're hoping to be there for the demolition of the chimney. It would be quite an interesting exercise. But I want to talk here about how, in some sense, the opposite to Chatley Whitfield, whereas Chatley Whitfield is a story of how a decommissioned heritage site enters a period of inaccessible stasis. Fawley Power Station, on the other hand, is an example of how a potential future heritage site comes to be destroyed before there's any chance for that heritage to be meaningfully established within the broader community. And the ways in which the same institutional tools are used in both of these sites to create a different, but in many ways, I would argue, equally tragic result for both of them. The one site I'm not going to be talking about today, I'm sure much to Ian's chagrin, is the West Burton site, which is our example of future decommissioning. And the reason for that is quite simple. I haven't yet really done any research on it, so that's kind of outstanding. But that's also a core part of the research project. In many ways, it's the I guess, for me at least, the aim is to provide a kinder path for decommissioning for that site in particular, because it's the only one of these three sites in which we can have a kind of a direct impact on how the decommissioning process evolves. With the other two sites, the decommissioning process is effectively already either complete or kind of underway. So those are the three sites. And I want to start by looking at Chatley Whitfield, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about its history as a working coal mine, largely because there's not actually a very clear distinction between its history as a working coal mine and its history as a heritage site, and then finally its history as an inaccessible derelict brownfield site. And to a certain extent, some of its history as a colliery obviously impacts on how successful it was as a heritage site, as what turned out to be quite in many ways, extraordinary museum. So I'm not going to spend a little bit of time on this. So on the slide here, you can see a map of the North Staffordshire coalfield. There were probably over 100 different collieries in this coalfield, and in fact, there are a couple of major ones that aren't listed on this map. So Kemble Colliery, which was the main training venue, which was in the middle of Stoke, somewhere around here, isn't listed. Neither is the Sneed Colliery, which was just south of Chatley Whitfield, sort of near to the Norton Colliery, which is a major place and quite an interesting site, because it seems from my current Being Human project that I'm running that it was at that colliery that most of Stoke's black miners worked. And there are a number of collieries missing here. But the important thing here, so firstly, Chatley Whitfield was one of the major collieries here, really, until it was overtaken by Woolstanton in the late 20th century. It was perhaps the premier colliery of Staffordshire, and it has been in operation since at least the mid-19th century. With the advent of British coal and nationalisation, the underground seams of the different mines and deep mines in the North Staffordshire coalfield were gradually linked together in order to take advantage of, I guess you might say, economies of scale. So basically, pumping could be shared across the different collieries. You could have systems where men went in and out of one colliery, and coal went in and out of another colliery. Air went in and out of a further colliery. So you could create these systems by linking together these collieries underground. And Chatley Whitfield was connected with the really big colliery in the region, Woolstanton Colliery, by the early 1970s. So there was a shaft underneath Stoke going all the way from Chatley Whitfield up here, all the way down to Woolstanton, and Woolstanton in turn was linked to all of the other collieries, I think up to Holditch. I don't think it was linked quite to Silverdale, which was kind of its own site, and I don't think it was linked. So Hemheath and Florence were linked together quite early on as well. I don't think they were ever linked in. So we had this kind of this super colliery that stretched up here, also included Victoria, I think, and the Sneyd collieries, as I said. So so underneath Stoke, the if you like the heritage of mining, the inaccessible passageways of coal minings interweave and bisect the entire city. So as well as being a kind of important set of heritage sites above ground, they also constitute an important role for things like urban generation, where you can build house prices and so on and so forth. So they continue to play an important role in the town, even if to a large extent, in fact, the history of coal mining, along with pottery, has largely been wiped off the face of the map. In Stoke-on-Trent, it's no longer a visible part of the skyline anywhere in the potteries. So that's kind of where things stood in the late 1970s, or the mid 1970s, just before Chatley Whitfield was closed. And at this stage, Chatley Whitfield wasn't a site that through which coal came. It was a place where men went down into the pit to work at Woolstanton, and which served as one of the key means to get air down to the miners at Woolstanton, basically. Now, in the early 1970s, so 1974, Chatley Whitfield was finally closed, and almost immediately there were some efforts to try and create a heritage venue at Chatley Whitfield. So it was perhaps one of the very first coal mining heritage sites to emerge, as it became clear that the future of mining as a whole in the UK was perhaps imperiled. And to begin with, these efforts focused on the slag heap site and the site of a former mineral railway, which was established because the site was also a site for iron mining as well. So we have this kind of Chatley Whitfield is part coal mine, but the site itself has also been an important iron smelting destination as well. So right from an early period, we had this effort to create a heritage venue, to change the site of Chatley Whitfield into something perhaps mid 1970s, perhaps more befitting a different future for Stoke-on-Trent. So this was an effort to create what is in many ways an urban park modelled very much on the basis of kind of stately bourgeois urban parks in, say, Manchester, Birmingham, London. Didn't come to anything. The slag heap pretty much remained, and for a long time the railway lines and so on and so forth in the Whitfield Valley, just below the Chatley Whitfield site. So the Chatley Whitfield site is up here, and that's the major colliery site. This is the Whitfield Valley where the slag heap was, and a number of other things. But and the railway and so on, and so really this came to nothing, and the area was effectively wasteland for the next 20 years or so. However, what did happen in the next couple of years was the creation of what I still think is a really quite remarkable heritage institution, which was called the Chatley Whitfield Mining Museum. Now, there wasn't very much of this museum above ground. Above ground, it was limited effectively to a canteen, which was the old lovely, beautiful 1930s canteen for miners, and also entrance gallery. And then there were a couple of machinery exhibits, especially in the Hesketh Winding House, which is this collection of this huge collection of steam engines that remained in the 1970s on site. Underground, however, it was quite a different story. So visitors to the mining museum were put into a cage, and I'm going to have to get my shafts right here, but the Winstanley shaft, I think, took visitors down, and most of the exhibit effectively was 700 feet below the surface in a real existing mine shaft. One that obviously had ceased working, but nevertheless an actual coal mining shaft. There's obviously a lot of planning that went into this, but effectively the arrangement was that because mining was continuing at Woolstanton, and in fact this was a period of significant expansion at the Woolstanton colliery, Woolstanton could now help to maintain Chatley-Whitfield by pumping water out of the mining museum and allowing it to use this underground exhibit at the Holly Lane level. In terms of how the exhibit was managed, and there isn't very much that remains. As you'll see, there's a reason for that. Obviously, I'm guessing there's quite a bit that remains underground, but I can't get to it because it's all been sealed off. But even in terms of photographs and so on, it's very difficult to get an idea of exactly what this looked like and how it served. I mean, it was a 1970s mining exhibition. I believe there was some living exhibits, so living history type exhibits, and certainly that was something that was a move that was going on at the same time in the wider Stoke-on-Trent region, so at the Gladstone Pottery Museum, for example. And most of it was staffed by miners who either used to work at Chatley-Whitfield or otherwise had a connection with the mining industry, or used to work at one of the other coal fields and had since retired. So it was staffed largely by volunteers who had some connection with mining. And it sought to tell the history, as you might expect, of mining underground in North Staffordshire in particular. Now, in 1985, there were the strikes, which I'll come on to talk about a little bit in a second. But in 1986, Woolstanton colliery closed, which was really the last large-scale colliery in North Staffordshire. And as you remember, as I said earlier, these two collieries were linked underground, and the Chatley-Whitfield Mining Museum was reliant on Woolstanton for pumping water out of its underground exhibit. And so within a matter of weeks of Woolstanton closing, the leadership of the museum at Chatley-Whitfield were forced to also close their own underground exhibit, which, since it constituted almost the entire museum, basically meant that the museum had to close. But that wasn't an end to it. What they did was they built a new underground mining experience in one of the old railway sidings. They created a new lift, which went down, I think, the plat shaft. I think it went down the plat shaft and out of the Institute's shaft. And in this lift, they would drop about 30 feet, but it was managed in such a way that you would appear to drop down 700 feet. They exposed a new coal face within the siding, so that it had to be registered as a coal mine, in fact. And because this was an actual museum space, they didn't have to adapt an old mine working. In many ways, this was actually a significant improvement on the previous museum experience and exhibition. And so there's quite an interesting history to be told here about how local communities engaged with coal mining. And I think this isn't something that we're necessarily going to explore very much in the existing project, the current project. But I do think there's going to be quite a lot of work here, especially on the use on school trips, moving around the Chatley-Whitfield underground mining experience, how they understood it, use of pit ponies, for example, and so on and so forth. And it does strike me as a particularly interesting museum, because in many ways it was run on this kind of technical basis. Most of the archive is full of these drawings, which aren't, in some senses aren't unusual. Of course, if you do any sort of building planning, then these drawings are going to be built up. But it's not hard to provide evidence that, well, the people drawing up these buildings are the same people who are designing the actual coal mines mine shafts and so on and so forth when the mine itself was open. So the museum was this kind of, in that sense, there was this sort of culture, I think, at the museum, which was a genuine continuation of the Chatterley Whitfield colliery itself. It wasn't like the colliery closed and then some other people came in to set up a museum. I mean, there were people who came in from other parts of the industry, and not everyone was a miner, but it seems clear to me that especially in cultural terms, the museum in many ways facilitated continuation of some of the ways of working and cultures of the miners it had operated before it had closed. So we have this it's a much deeper history of continuity here than I would expect at a normal heritage site. Although I'm going to hold up my hands and say I'm not an expert on heritage here. So that was the underground mining experience. We have a little bit more evidence from this, some evidence from school trips and so on and so forth. There was much more photographic evidence of what this looked like. And on the right here, this would be typical of the sort of exhibit. It's fairly sort of traditional museum fare. It's the sort of thing I would think you would expect from a museum in the 1970s and 1980s. So models of people and significant mining equipment, classic chronology, and not so much in the way of questioning, for example, the roles of mine managers and so on and so forth. Although certainly these exhibits absolutely did cover the things like tragic losses of life in mining accidents and the hard work that many miners went through. So in some ways this was quite forward-looking, and in other ways it was quite traditional. It was what I would expect from a museum of its era, basically. Nevertheless, there's clearly a lot of interest to be had here. But still, these underground mining exhibits were very clearly quite expensive to run. They needed maintaining and they needed critically to be heating. And the museum gradually gained, if that's the right word, or was given responsibility for the wider Chatterley Whitfield site. And this was basically the story of its gradual decline into financial problems. So the miners' strike, again, this all requires a bit more research, but the miners' strike was definitely a clear turning point, I would say, in the fortunes of the museum, not just because it not long after it heralded the closure of the Woolstanton mine, and so the miners' strike had some impacts on the Woolstanton mine, which made it less profitable, but also because during the miners' strike, as far as I can work out, the museum workers in the museum itself didn't join the miners out on strike, and that it seems there was a picket line outside the mine. Now, what impact this had on the relationship between the mine and local communities, many but not all of which were on strike for all or not all of the strike, is something which I think probably requires some extra exploration. And we need to bear in mind that a museum about coal mining wasn't necessarily something that all coal miners approved of in and of itself. Many coal miners were absolutely not enthusiastic about their children going into the really horrific and dangerous and problematic industry that was coal mining. So I think there was a for some miners it would have been a problem, and there was documentation suggesting that they saw it as being in some sense a bit problematic for the museum might be set up if it in some way celebrated the work of the miners in an unproblematic way. So the miners' strike was an important event in the history of Chatterley Whitfield, but really it's the closure of Woolstanton mine, construction of the new exhibit, which starts a kind of a downward trend. In 1988, the museum inherited this vast collection of mining equipment from British Coal, and I'm sure at the time this looked like a really big coup for the museum, certainly from the perspective of the museum. But of course, this included significant amounts of large equipment, and the museum now had to find places to put all of this stuff basically on site. And then a year after this came about, British Coal, who was still present on the site and effectively helped pay for some of its maintenance, as well as in some ways, I think providing a kind of a central institution, which meant that a series of other organisations also used the site for business purposes and thus paid, in some cases, paid rent or provided services to the museum. But in 1989, British Coal withdrew entirely from the Chatterley-Whitfield site. So a year after providing with this coal collection, it then withdrew from the site, and thus the site, suddenly the whole site was the responsibility of the museum. From 1990 on, so the museum from this point onwards is basically looking for emergency forms of income generation, and it resorts to increasingly desperate measures. From 1990 on, it starts scrapping. I mean, I've put down large exhibits here. That's not strictly speaking true. A number of the things that the museum was scrapping was simply some of the stuff that was lying about the site. But in any case, it was resorting to scrapping some of the stuff that was on the site in order to maintain the basic running of the museum. And in the early 1990s, there were also attempts to invest in small drift mines. So these are mines that are cut into the hillside rather than having pit heads, in order to help fund the museum. But these all failed, I think, because the seams near the surface all proved to be worked out. In 1990, for reasons that I need to confirm this all and so on and so forth, but for reasons that I'm not quite sure of, and to an extent that I'm not quite sure of, Stoke-on-Trent City Council cut its batch of funding and the museum, and it seems, again, I need to confirm this, and it seems refused an offer from the other local key sort of local constituency, Newcastle under Lyme, local borough of Newcastle under Lyme, refused an offer from them to help fund the museum. So in 1993, the museum went into liquidation. The collections that it owned were auctioned off through an auctioneer in Birmingham, and so much of the archive that it had built up, as well as a number of the collections were permanently lost through being auctioned off. And I think this is what happened to a lot of the collection of mining ephemera and artifacts. Although again, I need to check a lot of this out. So far, I've only been able to get into the Chatterley-Whitfield archive itself, which isn't a full archive. So there's quite a lot going on there. Now, in 1993, I guess in a sense, in kind of a response to this sort of sudden process of liquidation, which I've in many ways kind of glossed over here because I don't want to go into the. I think there's some personal politics involved, and I don't really want to go into that. But in 1993, members who were associated with the museum applied to Historic England for Chatterley-Whitfield to gain ancient monument status, so as the highest, effectively the kind of the highest protection accorded to buildings by Historic England, and they were successful in that. So most of the site is now fully protected. It's either that or listed, which means that on the one hand, it's very difficult for anyone to come in and knock the buildings on the site down. On the other hand, it also means that it proves quite difficult to do anything with the site. So really, in some ways, this has both ensured its preservation, but also has resulted to an important extent in the story of stasis, which really characterises the site since then. There have been a number of sort of redevelopment and regeneration plans based on seeking to attract business or sometimes energy infrastructure to the site. I mean, I've said failed here. Not all of them have failed. There was one in the early 2000s which successfully redeveloped some of the site, and those buildings are still being used. But it didn't lead to a wider redevelopment of the site as a whole, and it's now rendered inaccessible because it's considered dangerous. And so, with every with every continuing year becomes more expensive to open up and turn into any sort of sensible heritage facility. Now, outside of the mine, it's a slightly different story in that on the eve of the end of the 20th century, the big slag heap, which you can see on the picture behind you, so there's this massive landmark sort of pyramidal slag heap that stood over much of Stoke-on-Trent for half a century. And this was flattened, largely as a result of the Aberfan disaster. So there was fears that it could also landslide. And the tip itself was largely refurbished and turned into what is now a country park. So that park that I showed you earlier, that whole area now is a kind of a wildlife reserve. So to that extent, the area around the site is now forms an important environmental role, even if in many ways its heritage site, as a heritage site, its meaning has been largely erased. So so that's Chatley Whitfield. It's been through a process through which it's been in some sense saved, but we're now talking about getting on for 30 years in which this site has effectively simply stood in some sense kind of untouchable by heritage, by any sort of project, by a city council which is very strapped for cash and probably has other things that it could use, the 60-odd million pounds that would be required to redevelop this site, and has other things on which to use on. There is some hope for the future at the moment, because the new MP for Stoke-on-Trent has kind of made it his project, and has raised this before Parliament. So I think there's probably hope from getting a bit more funding, but at the moment nothing's going on. So for this site, it's a mixed picture, isn't it? It's the institutions of heritage have, on the one hand, probably saved it from demolition. On the other hand, have created a site which is very clearly derelict. Is a site which I know a lot of local people really regard as a place that symbolises the problems in many ways of Stoke-on-Trent, and yet a site which in many ways seems to promise quite a lot. But I also want to talk very briefly about Forley and what's happened to this site. So Forley, again, I'm just going to introduce a bit of a map here. So Forley Power Station is situated on on Southampton Water, just as it enters the Solent, opposite Southampton, or just a bit south of Southampton rather. And as you can see on this picture, it is actually inside the New Forest National Park. So all of the yellow area here is inside the New Forest National Park, and it's just situated on the edge of that just there. So it is within the New Forest National Park, at least on maps. I have to do a little bit of research on this, but it does seem to have applied for the owners of it applied for an exclusion soon after the New Forest National Park came into being, presumably so that future planners didn't run aground of national park regulations. The national park has been involved in decisions related to the new redevelopment. Basically, when Forley was built, it was given effectively a kind of a free pass from suffering the fate, if you like, of Chatley Whitfield, in that it was not possible, not allowed for English heritage or other statutory organisations to list it or to otherwise seek to protect it. So that meant that when it closed, local campaigners who really wanted to see at least some of the site retained, and especially its chimney, which had become a bit of a landmark for the Solent Water, or at least turned into a part of the nature reserve in the New Forest, which was in many ways what the original site before the power station had been. That those efforts were unlikely ever to be successful, because very quickly Forley became to be designated, as I understand it anyway, again, I need to do more research on this, but as Forley very rapidly came to be designated effectively as a brownfield site, and thus open to more urban redevelopment, and that in many ways is what's happened. So the Fawley Waterside development is now going ahead. As I said, the chimney is soon to be demolished, and this is, I suppose, in a sense, tells a different picture, tells a different story to the Chatley-Whitfield one, in that really there's been a rapid demolition and erasure, or it will be a rapid demolition and erasure of the site of Fawley from the wider landscape. And whilst I'm sure there will be some, well, I'm sure there will be some heritage aspects to the new development there. It's not. I think it's extremely unlikely to really reflect the existence of this quite significant piece of landscape infrastructure for the surrounding communities, and nor is it being given back effectively to the national park and the New Forest Nature Reserve. So this is in effect the building of the power station has led to an urban expansion in what would otherwise have been a national park and protected natural region. So here we see a different set of events involving many of the same institutions, but managed in a different way to result in really in many ways a very different outcome. So we have these two kind of narratives of decommissioning here, and it's really that neither of these have emerged as a particularly, at least for local communities, from a local communities perspective, necessarily as a particularly happy resolution to decommissioning in the medium to long term. We don't really know what's going to happen to Fawley, of course, in the medium to long term, but certainly in the moment, it's fair to say that the new development has been controversial. So what we're seeking to do then really is to provide, or seek to provide, a more kind of holistic way in which local communities might be involved in decommissioning right from the start of its process. And to a large extent, this is really the rationale to our original projects. The background to this is in many ways Britain's kind of zero carbon strategy as it's existed since 2011. But also, it wouldn't need to be that. I mean, I think that the growth of renewable energy and the gradual move away from fossil fuels is going to lead to the closure of a significant portion of the United Kingdom's and indeed the world's existing 20th century industrial infrastructure. Some of that, of course, has already happened. We've witnessed the demolition and disappearance of an enormous number, a significant number of coal-fired power stations over the last few years. But in the longer run, if we're going to switch, for example, to electric cars, then we're going to be talking about oil refineries and its related infrastructure, both for energy and for chemicals potentially as well. So there's quite a lot at stake here in terms of the sort of buildings that we'd be talking about here. And so in many ways, that's what we're referring to when we're talking about the decommissioning of the 20th century. It's about the decommissioning of the power and energy infrastructures upon which the 20th century largely relied. We also know from the experience of places like Chatley-Whitfield and North Staffordshire that previous processes akin to decommissioning, the closure of large-scale industrial plants, has led to some pretty detrimental consequences for the communities that live and worked at many of these plants, but also to the ways in which those communities view one another, things like social cohesion, the local environment in terms of the pollution of waterways and so on, and to wider well-being. So decommissioning is a process that has real-world effects, and so as these places become heritage venues, or have become potential heritage venues, we need to build in how far local communities want or seek, or feel that they want to be involved in that process. For many local communities, it may be that they don't want to keep these sites, of course. We also wanted, on the whole, across both of these projects, but this is particularly talking about the second one of these, the ones of our project, second of our projects, planning creativity. We wanted to think about how we could encourage a better bridge between well, what normally termed kind of participatory forms of planning. So these are the sorts of forms of planning which I think probably heritage scholars are more familiar with, the sort of participatory forms of engagement in what might happen. And this is particularly represented in many ways by neighbourhood planning, but also by the sorts of consultation exercises that go along with many planning applications. We wanted to try and find a bridge between that and the, if you like, the bigger kind of data-driven forms of planning, which typically involve computer modelling and take place at a vastly kind of larger scale. So they very rarely deal with kind of local circumstances, instead of dealing with much kind of bigger issues and changes and things like traffic and so on and so forth. And the concern was that each of these fails to speak to the other. So it is the case that data-driven planning processes often fail to include participatory elements or don't really know what to do with them. But it's equally the case that participatory forms of planning rarely understand or are even aware of the existence of planning processes which are driven by these kind of more data-formed models. So somehow we need to find a way in which each of those might speak to another. In other words, for example, is it possible for people to participate in the creation of data-driven planning processes? Is it possible for participatory forms of data to be incorporated into data-driven planning processes? And we wanted to do that in a way which still allows for the sorts of contestation and division and so on and so forth, which really characterises the sorts of information that arises from both arts and humanities style analysis and from those kinds of participatory planning processes that I think probably many people here are quite familiar with. There's also an issue about access here, and here this is something which we sought to tackle through the building of a 3D model, which I'll come on to talk about a little bit just in a second, because that's something which we've actually been able to go ahead with. And finally, we want to think about, okay, well, one of the issues here is really the capacity of local community groups to be involved in decommissioning, and so we wanted to think about, okay, how might we create a way in which the capacity of these local community groups to understand and take part in what are often complex processes might be encouraged. So we've faced a series of kind of core research questions. We wanted to find out what a more holistic process for decommissioning might look like, and we wanted to include local communities in that research. So rather than doing research on these local communities, this is very much a kind of a co-produced model for research. And I'll come on to talk a little bit about how we were going to do that. We wanted to find out what the role of arts and humanities knowledge might be in these processes of decommissioning. As our kind of core methodology, we adopted sort of co-creative techniques and how we might best be used. But again, a lot of this is, our ethos is really to allow our people to lead this research rather than us enforcing co-creative techniques upon them. We wanted to find some research. I've gone through some of these, I think, in what I've said so far, what the central challenges for communities living with these sites might be. And there's this issue of a gap, which I've already covered. And finally, I guess one of our other objectives, and one which I think we're probably going to focus a little bit more on in the new kind of reworked version of what we're going to be talking about, was this issue of how far local communities might benefit from networking from each other. Because we pretty quickly realised that the communities we were working with had quite different experiences and expertises. So the Friends of Chatterley Whitfield had a long history of experience with processes of decommissioning, of writing funding bids, of working in a very complex and difficult site, and so on and so forth. But they lacked necessarily expertise in planning processes, for example, or in artistic engagement. Whereas the community we're working with at West Burton are much more interested in the kind of artistic aspects and aesthetic aspects of the site and how to portray them. And the community that we're working with in the New Forest is much more knowledgeable about planning. It includes a large number of planning professionals. So by linking these groups together, we felt that we might be able to increase the capacity of these local communities to engage more effectively in decommissioning processes and put their voices forward. And so, we came up with a series of core things that we aim to do. We wanted to create an inter-community network. We wanted to create a process that allowed communities of decommissioning to take control of the process that we were creating. So rather than us coming with a research idea and testing it, we were going to work with communities to define what this new process for decommissioning might involve. We wanted to think about co-creativity, but we also wanted to try and bridge this gap between participatory and data-driven planning that I was talking about earlier. And so we would really look to a model of crowdsourced heritage, which I'll talk about in a moment. And finally, there was a series of knowledge exchange issues, which we really needed to get to grips with as well. So core to our projects were 3 iterative workshops at each of the 3 sites. For reasons that I'm not going to go into, we weren't quite going to do past, present, future, but rather start at Chatley Whitfield. We ended up starting at Chatley Whitfield, then moving to West Burton, and then finally Fawley. This is largely to do with cost. At each of these workshops, we were going to carry out a workshop alongside co-creative facilitators, so local artists used to working in co-creative ways. And at each of these workshops, we were going to invite people from the other 2 sites to come along and participate as well, in order to get an outside perspective on some of the processes, and so that each workshop could sensibly feed into the plans for the future workshop. So at the end of each workshop, we would get feedback from those people who had been involved, and then alongside them seek to develop the next workshop, in order, hopefully, at the final workshop, the last of the 3 workshops, to then find a process which the people who are involved in the project could take effective ownership of. So we were going to have a 2-day workshop at Chatley Whitfield, 2-day workshop at West Burton, 2-day workshop at Fawley, in which we sought to define what a new format for decommissioning and the involvement of communities in the decommissioning of industrial sites might be. On planning creativity, we also, to the second of these 2 projects, we also sought to experiment with a crowdsourced heritage website, and this is really the only thing that's just kind of moved forward, although it's run aground in a number of other ways, which I think I probably won't go into. I mean, I can talk about it if you wish, but I'm not going to bother, I think. But really, the aim here was to create a case study, a pilot study, if you like, of how far heritage sites connected with decommissioning might think about utilising crowdsourced heritage as a way of collecting information about these sites from people in the local community who might be unused to getting involved in heritage in normal ways. So our crowdsourced heritage site is basically a place where people can submit their memories of Chatley Whitfield or its museum, any images or documents and so on that they've got stored in their lofts, and also a place where we can hopefully put up some of the archive that still exists at the colliery. Alongside this, we're hoping still to create a digital 3D model, which will then provide a guide through some of this archive that we're going to create through our crowdsourced heritage project. So effectively, you'll be able to click on buildings within this 3D model, and that will take you to some of the sources that people have submitted about that particular building or that particular space in the site. So we sought to do this within a relatively cheap way, so that it might be open to local community organisations to use, with a reasonable project funding. Right, so this is the sort of thing that people might be able to bid for in order to be able to provide a way of engaging with wider community about these particular sites. At the same time, we designed the Chatley Whitfield Online, as it's currently called, in such a way that planning professionals might be able to utilise the broader data, so the data as a whole, in order to build that into their planning models. So utilising crowdsourced heritage and placing it online might allow people, for example, to present arts and humanities derived data in the form of heat maps or in the form of for example, text mining to find out which buildings, for example, at Chatterley Whitfield in a more nuanced way might be important, and to do so in a way which retains some of the inherent complexity of this style of source. Now, it's proven to be a bit more challenging and problematic than I was expecting, but in that, I suppose, in a sense, it's quite interesting. But I still think that this has the potential to fulfil some of those core issues. And finally, we also engaged in we also sought to engage co-creative practice. Now, this is basically it's a bit more than community involvement in art. It's the creation of art by a combination of professional artists and communities acting together in order to create specific and often public works of art. And often these are works of art which include include participation from local community projects. This is something which scholars at Keele are quite engaged in. I know it's not completely kind of new and original, but I've worked a lot with an organisation called Urban Wilderness, who are also involved in this project, particularly on brownfield sites, in which basically we take children onto brownfield sites and get them to build stuff on brownfield sites. We've also done work on mining memories already, related to Silverdale Colliery with another of our co-investigators, Kerry Morgan, on the Seams project at Keele, and this was with another local co-creative organisation, which is the dance and performance art group called Restoke. And finally, there's also Claybody Theatre, who are kind of if any of you have ever been to a Punch Drunk performance. They do the same style of a similar style of immersive theatre, but they do it utilising and alongside and co-created by local people, normally in Stoke-on-Trent and the surrounding area. So we were drawing on quite a rich emerging kind of movement of co-creative production in Stoke-on-Trent and in some of the other communities that we're working with, and seeking how far that might be an important and a useful way in which to build evidence about the meanings and significance of these future heritage sites of 20th century industry. So that's a kind of a broad kind of outline of these projects. But I now just want to spend a little bit of time. I've kind of lost track of where I am in my time, really. I've gone a bit over. I'm sorry. I now want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's happened to the projects as a result of COVID-19. So basically, the iterative workshops can't be done basically in COVID-19 circumstances, and the objectives that they were seeking to meet are just not possible to complete online. So we're going to have to change those wholesale. Unfortunately, most of the rest of both of the projects were in some sense based on these workshops, right? So we built the rest of the projects around the outputs from these workshops. So the loss of these workshops means that really we're having to redesign pretty much the whole of the rest of the project. The 3D model to go alongside the crowdsourced heritage website is not yet complete, but we do hope that we'll be able to do that inside of the project, perhaps during a period of non-lockdown for COVID-19. And we have been through a period of rolling 3-month extensions to the AHRC. Now, originally that was promised for a maximum of 12 months. It's now not completely clear exactly where we're going to end up with that. We may well get the 12 months, and hopefully we will extension. But I think we're now starting to replan on the basis that we're not going to get that. But in any case, if we were to get it, the chances are that we're going to have to replan these projects in January anyway, because the outbreak isn't going to be over. So effectively, we're in a situation now where really we're not going to be able to run this project as we originally planned. And it's very difficult to see how we're going to be able to move this online. So effectively, we're in a situation where we're having to replan on the basis of our objectives, perhaps, but even some of those may have to be modified. I'm just going to say, so one of the key aspects of that is that basically what we've ended up is that we've just got an enormous amount of money that we need to spend. Most of the money on both projects is still remaining. And so to a large degree, we're now in a situation where we need to find a way of spending this money in order to meet the project objectives. And this is largely because a lot of this money would have gone towards doing these workshops. with travel and catering and room rent and so on and so forth, and we're now not going to spend that on them. So, in some ways, COVID-19 has been, we can be quite positive about it, because it's not like we've lost all of this money on this project so far. Rather, it just can't happen in the way we originally planned, but it can happen in very different ways. And we're in the process of redesigning that. So in some ways, it's very exciting. Even if it's disappointing not to be able to run the project as we originally intended. Currently, we were going to run a series of light projections at Chatley Whitfield on the original project as a way of highlighting the role of creative art in our projects. And I think now we're probably going to be looking to expand that kind of art installation and responses to art installations aspect of the project and focus the research around that. We're certainly going to hold a series of online workshops. They're probably going to be a lot shorter. And they're probably going to be focusing on thematic issues as well as the actual sites. And there'll be more of them, I think, and they will involve people from all three sites. I think we can focus a bit more on the kind of inter-community networking part of the project, which was in there previously. So we had an end of project event which was going to help facilitate this, but I now think we can think about spending some money on creating a digital forum in which we might be able to expand that aspect of the project further. And finally, we can now, I think we'll be able to use some of the money at least to pay for more in the way of public targeted publications, both online and physical. So so we have a few ideas about where we go. It's more focused on co-creative installation, and of course on online. Online forums and the crowdsourced heritage elements of it. So somehow we've had to work around the fact that we're not going to be able to do these iterative workshops. But I think more broadly, I put these questions in the abstract, so I'm not going to go very much further than simply stating them. I think COVID-19 does raise some broader questions about projects like these. In that, I'm not sure that we should see COVID as this, completely unpredictable thing that happened upon us. In fact, as historians, we were, and most epidemiologists were pretty sure that a big worldwide epidemic was going to happen fairly soon. And it's not the only major catastrophe that can happen in the world. So, I think there is a question to be said. Okay, should we actually be thinking about how we can make the outcomes of this kind of public engagement research flexible enough to meet the kind of not just the unknown circumstances of post-COVID, but also the potential challenges of the future. How can we and should we be assuming that this kind of crisis is quite likely in the future, especially in a future impacted significantly by climate change and and other environmental desperation. I think there's a question about, especially since this is involved in the decline of our carbon infrastructure, there's a question about what the pandemic's going to mean for carbon infrastructure and what we mean by carbon infrastructure itself. One of the things that's happened here is that people have started working more from home, which is a net carbon benefit, but has resulted in serious fears about the role of our existing city centres. Are city centres a part of the 20th century landscapes? 20th, are they a site that's going to get effectively decommissioned? What's going to happen to city centres? How can we manage that? Should that be built into this Decommissioning the 20th Century project? And given the extent to which nature became a kind of a focus, especially in the early part of the pandemic lockdown, if those city centres decline, what about these big infrastructure sites in the middle of the countryside? As identities come to be more intensely focused there, do they take on a new significance, or are they going to be put under increasing threat? I don't really have an answer to that. And finally, how far, we're talking about new heritage sites here, but as a result of the outbreak, we're going to be looking at at a serious problem for the existing set of heritage sites. And so how far, does it make sense for us to be thinking about what we might save from the 20th century over the next 2 or 3 years, when we might be really struggling even to save those heritage sites that we do have from other eras. So, I'm going to kind of leave those questions there, because they're ones that I think, do pose some difficult problems for the, to the heart of this project, and to heritage studies more broadly, I think. And we're going to leave it there. So, so thanks very much for listening. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time, but I've, I turned out to have quite a lot to say in the end. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks very much for that. We've got a little bit of time for questions. People can hear me?
Yeah.
It sounds a bit weird at my end, but nevertheless. Any questions, anything that people want to say, I think, in relation to this? I mean, I thought that was really fascinating for a lot of reasons, just to find out about the underground world beneath Stoke-on-Trent. But also, I think, I don't know if I'm feeling particularly pessimistic at the moment, but the kind of slow death of local heritage. I don't know, but I've no particular questions in terms of that, but that was really fascinating. Thanks, Ben. Anyone, anything that people want to say in relation to this? Yes, Tom.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Perfect. Just in terms of the site and development, co-creation, art installations, my question is there a possible class conflict with your narrative by using artists and arts to help promote a working class site? So I'll extend on that. And then, is art co-created plans potentially alienating your local community? And are you essentially leading to having a very omnivorous consumer, essentially? So is there a conflict with art and working class institutions?
I mean, I suppose my basic answer to that is no, not in my experience so far. I mean, I think there would be a risk here if we were to take a co-creative heritage organisation from Stoke-on-Trent, and then to utilise that as a way of engaging with people in West Burton Power Station or Forley, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I've resisted using urban wilderness for anything outside of Stoke-on-Trent. I do think there's a problem there. However, I mean, basically urban wilderness, for example, I mean, I suppose, given that the leader of it is an artist, she counts as middle class. I mean, but I mean, this isn't a group which parachuting into this community. Their entire ethos and work is based in these communities. They're quite well known, really, in the locality, quite well respected, and frankly, I wouldn't have been able to get to half of the people in the local area if it wasn't for their existing work. So I think, I agree. I can see where you're coming from, but I would say, so long as you're careful and you're using the right organisations, it's fine. And to be honest, it's the most working class group that we're working with really is the Chatterley Whitfield Friends. They love art. I mean, I think we need to be careful about about assuming that that art isn't something that working class people are interested in. I go in there, they've got a heritage centre, half of it is like recently produced modern art. So I don't think there's a contradiction there. I think they see it as a really important part of the site, and and frankly, for coal miners, art was a massive escape. People were really, you don't have to go very far to find coal miners who are basically local photographers who are documenting wildlife. If you saw Autumn Watch recently, there was an example, right? There was art is a really significant part of a lot of these sites already, and so the idea of using art to engage people is not something which is kind of alien to these particular sites. But I can see where you're coming from, and it is difficult and problematic to get this. And I suppose in a sense, one of the things that we're trying to do by encouraging communities to tell us what a good process for this might be themselves is to try and find out just how problematic that is, because frankly, middle class facilitators for community engagement is how it's done currently, right? So we want to find out how it might be better done in a way which perhaps is less class led, as you point out. I suppose finally, I'd probably just say that I'm not completely sure that we're dealing always with working class communities here. Chatley Whitfield, yes, largely at least, although not entirely. There are plenty of professionals that worked at the Chatley Whitfield site in particular, and worked for the museum. But if we're talking about Fawley Power Station, I mean, just how many of the workers at Fawley Power Station can realistically be classed as working class? And I think that's probably true of West Burton as well. If you're electrical engineering manager, you're really not working class. So I think in some ways some of these communities, especially when we're talking about power stations, are actually not working class communities at all. I think there is, and I suppose there's an issue there in terms of the wider project, because once you start talking about oil refineries and North Sea oil, then we are talking about a much broader working class constituency, alongside still quite a significant group of middle class professionals. So it's, we're quite mixed groups here, really, and I think we probably need to acknowledge that. But it is, it is difficult, and I think engaging with the working class people in each of these areas is going to be a challenge. Dare I say it, I think potentially particularly for Fawley, for which there's a massive working class community just across the Southampton water, but that isn't a community which is necessarily very engaged in or invested in the the Fawley Power Station site. So it is, these things are problematic. I'm not, but I think they're problematic perhaps in different ways than that sort of class distinction suggests. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else? Anyone, Anna?
Can I just, I think it was a very interesting talk, but I'm concerned about the time. So can I suggest that we mail questions to Ben, and so you can address them later on, perhaps?
Yeah, for sure. I'm very sorry I overran.
No problem.
No.
But we have another meeting that starts in 15 minutes. Okay. So I think it would be useful if we wrap up here. But if you can post your email in the chat, so people can send you questions, and so you can reply to them later on. But I thought it was very interesting, and yeah, a very different perspective on heritage sites in relation to the community involvement and in the context of the pandemic, the COVID-19. So thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you very much. And I think it's nice to, I do want some questions, because frankly, I'm not in a sense, critical heritage is in many ways a new research field for me, as many of you have probably noticed. And so, I'm really interested in what a perspective from that direction might add to what we're doing. It's a missing link that I'm aware of, definitely.
Yeah, and have you come across to the work of the big AHRC grant, Heritage Futures?
Yeah, no, we have. Yeah, I have seen the work there, and there's a lot of crossover there. Yeah. Between, in fact, to be honest, there's a lot of crossover there between that and the broader planning project that we're engaged in, which actually is. Well, it's not largely heritage focused, but there's a lot of heritage in it. So it's how these things link together. Because there's the Nature Futures. There was a Nature Futures program as well, which is a similar sort of relationship. So there's a lot sort of going on here, which is weird, because there's it's sort of being overtaken by government planning, new government planning regulations all the time. So, but anyway.
Well. Thank you so much, Ben. And we'll send you the questions if we receive them, or we send them. People will contact you directly. But yeah, thank you so much for this talk, and I'll upload it on the research website.
Sure. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Ben. Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.